be ready. No, I didn't ask you to do that, you jerk. Wait a minute. I'm afraid it's recording. I'm going to stop recording. Oh, okay, it's to the cloud. That's all right. I'll have to edit this, you jerk off. All right, here we are on a magic, what is this, Saturday the 5th, and this is our October meeting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this into speaker, and for some reason it's not showing me as the speaker, but that's odd. Maybe I have it to gallery. Well, anyway, all I wanted to do was to show my Svengoolie shirt for Halloween. I don't know if you can all see that. It came from Berwyn, and that's the official Svengoolie TV horror show host shirt. So, oh, with that bit of atmosphere, we are so lucky to have Andy Duncan speaking to us about fringe benefits of science that has been either disproven or considered fringe, where the name comes from. And I see we may have another one. No, we don't have another one. I have to do letting people in, or anybody can let people in. So if I can't do it, and I'm going to now introduce Andy, who has an illustrious career at Frostburg. Is it Frostburg State or Frostburg?
It's Frostburg State.
Frostburg State, and is that in West Virginia?
It's in Western Maryland, up in the mountains.
Western Maryland.
I also sent you I also emailed you this morning the bio about the World Fantasy Awards and the Nebula Awards.
Yes, I saw.
So
You've won a Nebula. Is that correct?
It is.
All right. Well, you see, you're one of our major stars. So you won a number of awards, and unfortunately, with bandwidth problems, I can't pop it all in right during the meeting, everyone. But I will add it to our next announcement. And we're so fortunate to have Andy because we need this kind of creative thinking in science fiction. I won't go on too long, but this is one problem we have with linear thinking in science, is that when something has been disproven, it's no longer good for anything. And so these are scientific, either outside the realm of science, denied to be science, or disproven. But in science fiction, we may be able to recycle these things. And that's going to be the topic that Andy will share with us. And with all his awards, I'm sure he has recycled some of these things.
So, we all recycle a lot of things.
So did I do you justice, Andy?
Oh, you did fine. You did fine.
All right.
Thank you. It's a Saturday morning. We can't be too formal. Particularly when my video is not working. Don't worry, I'm not up to anything off camera. A couple of things. I just thought about it. Well, thank you, Gloria. Thank you, everybody, for having me. I have less of a I don't have a formal talk planned. I have a lot of talking points, and at some point, y'all can just start typing questions into the chat, or Gloria can open the floor to the raising of hands or anything like that. However y'all normally do it, it's fine. But okay, but anything that works. But just in those moments that Gloria was talking, I thought of two things that had not even occurred to me, believe it or not, before I sat down. One was a story I heard about the late Will Jenkins, who wrote as Murray Leinster, Leinster, a very well-known Golden Age science fiction writer. I believe Michael Swanwick told me this story because he was in context with Leinster's family at one point for a piece he was writing. But Leinster was an inventor. He was, I don't think he would have referred to himself as a scientist, but he just had that inveterate tinkerer's knack for problem solving. And he had patented a number of devices that provided good income for him, including one of the rear projection screens used in Hollywood in early special effects and probably still used. But according to when he went to cons, Jenkins liked to say that his process of creativity was the same for the fiction as for the science, as for the tech. If he got an interesting idea about a gadget, he would sit down and work on it intently, and until he reached the point where he realized whether it would work or not. If he realized it would work, he would keep working on it until he could send in a patent. If he realized it was not going to work, if there was some impossibility involved, or if we were just, a century early, he would move it from that work table over to the writing table, and he would write a story that pretended it did work. And his spectacular hit there is the famous story, A Logic Named Joe, which was not so well known at the time, but in hindsight, in succeeding generations, has become extremely known, and it gets rediscovered every 5 years or so in tech circles because it seems to predict not only personal computers and the World Wide Web, but just about every issue that has been publicly discussed and privately discussed about the web, from loss of privacy to viruses to online harassment. It just goes on and on. So that was a story not about where he died many years ago, but it would be interesting to hear from him whether he viewed that as an imaginary science or a not yet here science at the time he wrote it. But in any case, to my knowledge, he has no computing patents or World Wide Web patents. I think Tim Tim Berners-Lee's claim is safe there. The other thing that, and so that sort of, it still works, but for fiction, not for fact, is, I think, one of our themes today when we think about this stuff. The other thing that just occurred to me is that I know much more about fringe science than I do about science. My shelves groan with material on and it's hard to talk, as we all know. What constitutes accepted science versus fringe science versus pseudoscience is sometimes fighting words. And depending on who you're talking to. But my shelves groan with any of the stuff that has at any point been labeled anomalous. The late William R. Corliss of Glenarm, Maryland, his sourcebook project compiles in scores of volumes all the things he found in the scientific journals that the researchers acknowledged did not make sense, seemed to violate what was known at the time, was like put on the shelf to look into later. It was a much more precise and much more science respectful thing than what Charles Fort did, but it was basically the same principle. Charles Fort was focused not on all the science that had been embraced and proven and validated, but all the science that was somehow wayward or stray. and Corliss did the same thing. And I am fascinated in all that stuff to the point that I have been taking classes for years now online with the Rhine Center for at in Durham, North Carolina, which of course is the descendant of J.B. Rhine's original parapsychology lab at Duke University. Because, as y'all know, in the U.S., Rhine was the great pioneer, still controversial, in moving parapsychology from knocking around haunted houses and holding seances and visiting mediums, physical mediums in their layers, to moving it into a campus office and subjecting it to statistics. The best skeptical rebuttal to all that that I have heard is by a colleague, a science colleague, a biologist, who said, "Yeah, at the time we thought there was something there, but then our math got better and the effects went away." A point that would horrify and anger all my parapsychologist friends. But my point is, I bring this up because there are so many texts that take as a given that parapsychology is real, that ufology is real, that there's any validity there, and so forth, that we could basically talk for years, and indeed, many of our crucial texts in the field are work on those assumptions. If we take spec fic in the broader sense, not just science fiction, but science fantasy and rationalized fantasy and the supernatural and so forth. So almost from the moment Gloria and I talked about this title, I started zeroing in on which I think is a much narrower but very interesting and very fruitful way of thinking, which is science fiction writers who apply science fiction rigor to ideas that were long since discarded or disproven or that just fell out of fashion for whatever reason. As our information got better, our instruments got better. And I think and there is a lot of this. Gloria, that's who, I'll type his name in. William R. Corliss of the Source Book Project. And that he has an impressive body of work. He died a few years ago, and I corresponded with him a little bit, but never met him. And I just am really taken with his books. I do not think they are being kept in print, but I think somebody is still selling them, and you can find them on the used markets in the various places. They are a full library of them would be very worth having. Excuse me, I'm drinking some water. The point I was making about the rigorous extrapolation of if you will past science or non-science. The exemplar, I think, who is very much with us is Ted Chiang. I'm sure everyone in the audience is familiar with Ted Chiang, his many awards in the field. He is brilliant. Don't tell him I said it. He's I guess one of the two friends of mine that I routinely call when they're not around a genius, the other being Kelly Link. This annoys him and he will get back at me if he hears I was saying it. But he is, as you know, very highly regarded not just in science fiction now, but in the wider world. He is doing quite a lot of writing now about AI and big tech and the uh, taking things with a grain of salt. It was Ted who I have quoted for many years, who, when expressing his doubts about the singularity back when Werner Vinge and everybody else was talking about the coming singularity, he said he didn't buy it. And somebody in our group said, "Well, Ted, why don't you buy it?" And he walked over to the light switch and flipped it on and off repeatedly. And he said, "The singularity basically is a belief that if you just flip this light switch infinitely for an infinitely long time and at infinitely higher speeds, faster speeds, eventually the light switch would say, 'Stop that.'" And he did not think that was particularly likely. And unsurprisingly, now he is talking about AI in skeptical terms, but he is most skeptical about the ethics and the of the Silicon Valley. And since he worked for Microsoft for years as a contractor, I believe he like Cory Doctorow, a lot of other people, a lot of other prophets from the tech world. He's worth listening to. But look at much of the science fiction that Ted has published, and my handout that Gloria will share later is largely a list of Ted Chiang stories. The very first story he ever published, that was in Omni, remarkably in 1990, a generation ago, was Tower of Babylon. It won the Nebula Award. It was reprinted in Gardner's Year's Best Science Fiction. It has since been reprinted in other canonical anthologies. But what Tower of Babylon is about is the Babylonian view of the cosmos, and it's written as if the Babylonian view of the cosmos was accurate. It's written, and it's a conceptual breakthrough story. I think we're most of us familiar with that as like the characters discovering important information about the state of their world through scientific verification. And Chang said in 2002, long after the story had come out, he said in his story notes for his first collection, he said, "Tom Dish called this story Babylonian science fiction. I had not thought about it that way when I was writing it. The Babylonians certainly knew enough physics and astronomy to recognize this story as fanciful. But I understood what he meant. The characters may be religious, but they rely on engineering rather than prayer. No deity makes an appearance in the story. Everything that happens can be understood in purely mechanistic terms. It's in that sense that despite the obvious difference in cosmology, the universe in the story resembles our own." One thing I take from that is not only that Ted, from that early point, was subjecting even the ancient religious beliefs to the slide rule and the calipers of physical reality and of scientific investigation, but also that he viewed this as a sort of commonality with these people, as a sort of outreach for, oh, it's very well to say, oh, everyone was ignorant back then, but in fact, if we try to view their perception of the world as they saw it, if we try to walk walk a mile in their shoes, so to speak, we see that they had some insights. We see that um, they had a lot in common with us. And I love that dig about everything that happens can be understood in purely mechanistic terms. And so therefore that cosmos he's writing about is much like own in that overall sense. And this is not something that Ted does just occasionally. This is something Ted has done over and over. I will get back to his best known story, Story of Your Life, in a few minutes. But look at 72 Letters. That one won the Sidewise Award for alternate history. And this is about for where he has this interest in medieval views of science, medieval Judaism, and the rabbis who believed that um, language was so powerful that language alone could animate lifeless clay and turn it and perform an act of creation just by speaking it into existence. And the other thing that he got fascinated with is the idea of, I believe the term is preformation, the idea that in the germ cells of the parents, you see the fully formed organism there. Sometimes I think the anti-abortion people are have that same view of the world, but that's a whole nother topic and probably not for a science fiction group. But he's Ted again writes in his story notes. What I found particularly interesting about golems was the fact that they're traditionally unable to speak. Since the golem is created through language, this limitation is also a limitation on reproduction. If a golem were able to use language, it would be capable of self replication, rather like a von Neumann machine. And of course, von Neumann was like that's the thought experiment that leads to AI, the idea of the self-replicating thing. Um, and at the time, he continues about preformation. It's easy for people now to dismiss it as ridiculous, but at the time, preformation made a lot of sense. It was an attempt to solve the problem of how living organisms are able to replicate themselves, which is the same problem that later inspired the von Neumann machines. And when I recognized that, it seemed that I was interested in these two ideas for the same reason, and I knew I had to write about them. One of the few things I would say that Ted and I are similar is that in my writing process, if I think I have two separate ideas and I realize they're actually the same idea, that they intersect, then I know I'm onto something. And I know I have a much more interesting story than either of those ideas would have been developed in isolation. And so he writes 72 letters, which takes place in a world where all this is actually true, and as a result, you have mass production of golems in a factory setting and all the implications there. It's sort of, if you think of the classic Heinlein story, the roads must roll. It's sort of the roads must roll of the golem industry or the mass-produced golem network, which just goes to show just how weird the idea is. But that's nothing compared to some of the ideas that Ted has run with. Hell is the absence of God, where he takes the very same attitude, the very same mechanistic, scientific outlook, and applies it to, in particular, the New Testament's um, portrayal of angels and his issues with the book of Job. uh, and again, that's a it uses that um uh it takes that worldview seriously. And he said in his story notes on hell is the absence that uh it seems to me that the book of Job lacks the courage of its convictions. If the author were really committed to the idea that virtue is not always rewarded, should not the book have ended with Job still bereft of everything? And if you remember the book of Job, at the end, all is forgiven, and he gets a new wife and new children and new riches and new cattle and so forth. So it's one of the unlikely happy endings in world literature. Uh, but I just love that Chang is like improving, feels like he has to improve on the Book of Job there. But he also says perhaps I was thinking of Annie Dillard later on after he wrote the story. I remembered she once wrote that if people had more belief, they'd wear crash helmets when attending church and lash themselves to the pews because the angels of hell is the absence of God are like hurricanes, are like Hurricane Helene, and they have devastating effects wherever they churn up the ground and leave innocents dead everywhere they go. And if you're not into uh, Jewish mysticism and medieval and ancient scriptures and beliefs and medieval stuff, well, what about Exhalation, which is the title story of his second collection? And he there you eventually figure out that this very strange world that he's exploring and this very strange world where a scientist is trying to figure things out is in fact a story that has no chemical reactions in it at all. It's a universe that has only mechanical give and take. Um, and which of course is not the cosmos that we know. But in his Locus interview in 2011, he says, to me, what makes a story science fiction is not whether the universe has the same laws as our universe or not, but whether it is a universe in which the scientific method works. That is a more interesting distinction for me. By that criterion, Exhalation is a science fiction story, even though its universe bears no resemblance to ours. The same is true, he continues, for 72 Letters and for Tower of Babylon. Recapturing the experience of conceptual breakthrough, dramatizing that I will break in and say Ted means the act of scientific discovery, the eureka moment, is one of the things Ted continues science fiction is good at. You can just as easily do that in a completely made up universe with a totally different set of physical laws. The underlying process is the same, and I still think of it as scientific investigation. So I view, and there are more Chang stories that I could talk about here, like Division by Zero, for example, where in the very title we have an impossibility presented. But look at Story of Your Life. This is the famous story that won the Nebula. It is probably his most reprinted story. It was the foundation for the extremely good Denis Villeneuve movie Arrival, which was very faithful. Sarah Pensker and I spent an hour after we both saw Arrival, probably more than an hour, in a small discussion group, enthusiastically noting every change the filmmakers had made to the story and concluding that it was the right change because you had to make it more cinematic than the story was, much as we love the story. But there's a couple things to mention about Story of Your Life in this context. This is the story that tells us both simultaneously, it tells us the first contact story of Louise, the brilliant linguist, who is called in by the government to try to find a way to converse with these wholly alien beings that have arrived on Earth, and simultaneously, it is the story of how Louise comes to terms with the great grief, the great loss of her life, the death of her daughter, and and um, and the extent to which she begins thinking like the heptapods, thinking like the aliens, is the great is her great breakthrough there, both in deciphering the language and in deciphering her own trauma. It's an extremely ambitious story that I am only touching on here. It is brilliantly done. The part that Chang points to, um, that he just sort of shrugged off, is the physics aspect of it. There's a lot in the story about Fermat's principle of least time, which is in the story, it's one of Louise's breakthroughs in realizing that the heptapod's sense of time is not ours, experience of time is not ours. But Chang writes in his story notes when it was first collected, for those interested in physics, I should note that the story's discussion of Fermat's principle of least time omits all mention of its quantum mechanical underpinnings. The QM formulation is interesting in its own way, but I preferred the metaphoric possibilities of the classical version. So once again, he sort of walks away from what he knows to be true about this about Fermi's principle and focuses only at the more obvious, more, dare I say it, plot valid, metaphorical possibilities of it. But the thing he doesn't even mention in his afterward is that the whole thing is dependent on the strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The whole idea in linguistics that language completely determines your thoughts, that a culture that cannot express certain things in their language cannot literally think of those concepts, and that if you change the language, you change the concept, you introduce new concepts. Most people don't adopt the strong Sapir-Whorf anymore. They think, yeah, it's a factor, it's not the deciding factor. But it has been but there are precisely 3 texts tagged Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, I found out the other day, in the Internet Speculative Fiction database. And one of them is Ted Chiang's Story of Your Life, on which the whole story seems dependent, much more so than Fermat's theory. Something similar is going on, by the way, they don't tag it, in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, where the Tralfamadorians have a very different experience of time. But the other 2 that the database lists for this linguistic belief is Sheila Finch's, what's the title of Finch's book? Triad, came out in the 80s, which I have not read. I need to. I respect Sheila. I like Sheila. She's a fine writer. But the other one, which I definitely have read, and many of you have as well, is Samuel R. Delany's Babel 17 from the 1960s. And Delany has since said, I believe he told the Paris Review, that at the time he wrote Babel 17, he was a stone believer in Sapir-Whorf. He just thought that explained everything. And then he began to realize the problems with it. But he also said the realization of the flaws in that they caused me to begin considering the more complex linguistic mechanisms of discourse, you might say, gave me my lifetime project. So it was finding out the flaws in the problem and exploring the flaws that have basically determined much of what Delany has written since the mid 1960s in and out of science fiction, just the nature of language and how we construct language, how we derive meaning from language, how we put meaning into language, and so forth. So that's just a quick rundown of some of the really interesting ways people uh, have used this stuff, have used the things that don't quite work anymore. And I'm going to look at the messages in a moment. But just there's also just the complete fun and games sort of element where you can do various types of rigor, but you're also just coming up with a completely whack doodle premise and writing it as if it made perfect sense because it does to you and you convince the reader. The brand new Nathan Ballingrud novella, Crypt of the Moon Spider, has a moon of Earth that was colonized by human beings beginning in the 1920s, where there's lunarian life forms. There are rivers and streams and forests and all sorts of things. There's and so forth. His novel The Strange that came out last year, Ballingrud similarly, is doing similar things for Mars because it's basically True Grit on Mars set in 1931. It's sort of a Martian Western. So Ballingrud is a wonderful writer. He's not just playing games. He cares about his characters. Like Ted Chiang, he does everything you could hope for in fiction. And he also does this really interesting taking notions that seem to be absurd, but writing them with the courage of the convictions and making them a really useful tool for for science fiction writers. Um, and now let me and Carl Capek, yes, I think Chang was certainly thinking about Capek there in 72 Letters too, because he notes that the whole idea that the golem was created to like rescue the Jews from the pogroms is a modern idea. It came about in the 20th century, the early 20th century. You go back farther, the golems were the legends were all about the golem would do your chores for you, and that's much more what Karl Capek was writing about with his robots, the universal robots of the title. But Ted said if you go back to the very origins, he researches his stuff for years, and I'm in sympathy with that too. Um, I have a story coming up next year that a friend of mine pointed out I was actually talking about and working on precisely 10 years ago. So some things take a while. But when Ted went back far enough, he said if you go back there to the origins of the Golem legend, the Golem did no work other than demonstrate that you had the power of creation, that you could speak life into being. It was a much more mystic thing than just, oh, I'm going to have the robots do work for me. And that's what really got him interested. Um, but yes. So I don't want to fill up all the time. I've talked for 40 minutes. Did anybody have any thoughts, questions, further examples? Because I'm gonna type out right now because Gloria has already mentioned it. Because yes, Capek was also in Prague and was familiar with the Golem stories too. You're absolutely right,
I'm a big
Gloria.
student of Karl Čapek.
Oh, chop it.
I,
Okay,
yeah,
very good.
it has a hot check over the C. That means Chuck.
Okay, chop.
Um,
Yep.
but oops,
I
um,
can't. I can't pronounce my own name, much
I
less.
can't either. But but I know that is the phonetics, script of it.
But
But
I think you're right. I think Chapek had to
well,
be influenced
also,
by that.
also Franz Kafka was influenced by it, and I'm working on studies of finding the parallels between Kafka, who wrote in German, and Čapek,
Mhm.
who wrote in Czech, and who were not only influenced by the Golem legends, but also all the alchemists of Prague who came,
Uh-huh. Yep.
Kepler and Tycho Brahe, who found
Yes.
modern
Mhm.
astronomy, but were the court of Rudolf II's alchemists,
Mhm.
horoscope guys,
Mhm.
and whether they believed in it or not. But so there are what they call limbic areas between science and or
Sure.
twilight
Sure.
zones,
Sure.
especially in past time where these divisions didn't exist. I'm trying to
Yeah, they
straighten
didn't.
out.
They nothing was siloed. So
Yeah.
so the folks you just named, just like Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and so forth, they were trying to expand the limits of knowledge in every direction, including what we would consider mystic direction.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Like
but it's
creating.
and 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 I wonder if something similar isn't going on today, at least with the people that are really getting deeply into the hard problem of consciousness, for example, and I am not terribly sympathetic to like the way some people throw around the term energy and the way people uh, um, uh, sometimes deliberately um, um, claim that like science and religion are doing exactly the same thing. I tend to believe more like Google that those are non-overlapping magisteria. But I do think that when you start getting into serious neuroscience, when you start getting into the downright philosophical approaches toward the nature of the dream state, of alternate states of consciousness, the evolutionary benefits of that, things start getting pretty mystical pretty quickly. Even if you are using the scientific language for it and studying it in labs and MRIs and what have you. Um,
Speaking of MRIs, I don't mean to cut off there, but what you say completely reminds me of S.I. Hayakawa and language in action. He
uh-huh.
was involved with general semantics, which is partially uh, discredited, but not all. And part of the problem was he was ahead of his time.
Yep.
He's that people were organically wired in their responses to certain words that had affective heat. And he said
Mhm.
that we can't just overcome it by saying, I choose not to get affected by that word. It rewires what we now know of
Sure.
the allocation of neural resources, and it makes big highways for some buzzwords like substitute your own. But then people cannot easily pull out of a tailspin of just being whipped up. And he used Nazism and Stalinism as his two examples of two valued thinking. I think all of this is extremely relevant, but because of Noam Chomsky and his kind of work, Hayakawa got totally eclipsed.
And I think you think you see some of that, some of what Hayakawa was talking about and what general semantics was trying to do. There's a lot of general semantics in particular in mid 20th century science fiction circles. But look at the promotion of Esperanto as Uncle Forey Ackerman and others were doing
Yeah.
at certain times. Part of that was the idea that we would be better off as a species if we had a different language that we could use, that we all had in common, that did not have all these problematic elements. I mean, some of that is absolutely, it, as we that which we learn, the language we learn rewires our brains, rewires our reactions, our approaches to one another.
Yep,
It
and
it's all fascinating, and it's all material. To get back to what we said at the outset,
sure.
just like Will Jenkins slash Murray Leinster argued that that whether it works in the sense that you can go out and patent it and make your fortune, it works enough as a thought experiment, as a door onto new ways of looking at things, that it's plenty good enough uh, for science fiction among any number of other activities. But certainly, I think uh, certainly Chang is pointing the way to a lot of us uh, to do exactly that sort of thing. But I also have a kinship, I feel, with the fantasy writers who like really think about the implications of their world building. Fran Wilde, I know, when she wrote her recent trilogy about the Bone universe, where she actually tries to think through the old trope of the cloud city and the people flying from island to island in the clouds. She was actually so moved to find out exactly how that would work and how it would feel on the bodies of her characters that she did indoor skydiving. I think she ruled out outdoor skydiving, but
How
she did indoor skydiving. She taught with a lot of engineers, with hang gliders, with base jumpers, with people who design and fly in wingsuits. She did a lot of research into man-made wings throughout history, which is not just Da Vinci. That drawing is famous, but that's those books were marketed as fantasy, and indeed I have heard Fran describe them as fantasy.
could you
But
put a
boy, is
last?
it?
Oh,
But
could
is
you?
it?
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
I'll type
Yeah,
that in here. But that is certainly the three books are. Hang on a sec. Um, Updraft, Cloudbound, and Horizon are the three novels. They came out in the about gosh 8 or 9 years ago, and but that's a very I just to give a brief example. I don't think Tolkien felt the need to go down into mines so he could better write about the experience of dwarves. I don't think that was that was just not on his that was not on his radar. He was fascinated talk about language with what the dwarves and the elves would be, what their legends and lore would be, what their sagas would be, and so forth. But when you start like going and actually doing indoor skydiving and talking with wingsuit engineers to write a story about flying humanoid, then you are really thinking of your fantasy in a very science fictional way. Even if that, as we know, just would not work so well. Um, the something similar, and you can do a lot of things similarly with your social and political extrapolation. I mean, Le Guin does that in The Lathe of Heaven, where she takes this absurdist premise where the dreams are coming true and are shaping reality, but she really works her way through a whole bunch of scenarios there. The ones who walk away from Omelas, she takes there's like almost no explanation at all other than the metaphor of why this particular kid suffering protects everybody else in the city, but boy, does she really work out the psychological and emotional results of all that. Um, S.M. Sterling's The Sky People and In the Courts of the Crimson Kings are both really worked out extrapolations of suppose we had discovered a populated Venus and a populated Mars back during the Kennedy era. In fact, one of them starts with the initial Mars landing coinciding with the 1962 Worldcon and an all-star cast of science fiction writers watching it on television from the convention and being, shall we say, surprised by what happens. But I also think, the last thing I'm going to mention is that let's keep in mind the argument that Jeff Ryman, in particular, made about 20 years ago in the Mundane Manifesto, he and his Clarion West students. Clarion or Clarion West? One of the Clarions, sorry. The argument that, in effect, that faster than light drive, human contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, and other beloved tropes of science fiction were just as scientifically unlikely as the hollow earth or golems or the nested concentric spheres ever were. And that was a lively discussion that ensued. I'll put it that way. But if you look at it that way, then a story like, to invoke him again, Will Jenkins' story First Contact, and all the other stories about language and extraterrestrials, right through Story of Your Life, and more recently, Cadwell Turnbull, a lot of other people, all those conversing with extraterrestrial stories are in a sense taking place in a fantasy land. If you just view faster than light as this, if you view the speed of light as this absolute barrier in the universe, anyway, which I don't have the physics to argue one way or the other. I'm just saying that there might be. You don't necessarily have to go back to Gilgamesh to find some beloved tropes that may not have as much scientific underpinning as we sometimes think they are. But my gosh, I've been rattling for nearly an hour. Surely other people have something to
I'm
say.
waiting to hear from Bob and Nancy and Margot and Chris. Any of you? While you're thinking of your question, I'm just a little chatterbox here. Isn't that the basis of what H.G. Wells and Jules Verne used to argue about? Because Verne was much more using the technology of his day, and he said that that black box of how does it work of the time machine is an example of one of these things you've just listed.
Yes. Yep. I have heard many people say that because Le Guin, long after Wells, famously talked about the making the metaphor literal, which is one big thing she said science fiction did and always did and was very good at. And I have heard many people, per Le Guin, argue that Wells's time machine is like the best literalized metaphor that science fiction ever came up with. Because here's this actual machine that enables you to literally go back in time, go forward in time, and go back and forth and so forth. The way we all do in our thoughts, our dreams, our regrets, our hopes, our civilizations. But yeah, I think, and even at the time, of course, Wells knew that this was very unlikely to happen. But what an interesting way to explore what all those thinkers were discussing about the nature of time at in that era, and at a turn of the century moment where the thoughts of past eras and future eras was on everyone's mind. Yeah.
And I think also the uses that military people put these inventions to. I believe that was not only, it was in the film, and I think it was also in the story that often the person who originates something does not intend it to be one of the first things in the party where the businessman, I don't remember which one it was, he was played by Sebastian Cabot, said, "Oh, think of the possibilities for the Boer War. We can have people
Yep,
traveling, blah, blah,
that's
blah."
right. That's right. And yep.
So
Um,
there was blowback then from the inventor who didn't want to do that.
right. But once and here is one of the areas where I feel a great kinship as a fiction writer with scientists and inventors, and that is that uh, most of them have no more control over what people do with the discovery or the invention than a fiction writer has with what people do with what they've written. uh, it's just out of your hands. Look at all the people. I mean, we all, I'm sure, just saw the movie Oppenheimer and had
Mhm.
smaller, large discussion groups about it. But look at look at all the people that that worked on the bomb that ultimately tried to, from Oppenheimer on down, then tried to influence the use of the bomb, and Truman and every other successor just said, "Well, see you later. Here's your medal, here's your handshake, and now we'll decide what to do with this stuff." And it is an ongoing problem. Did Tim Berners Lee imagine the extent to which bullies tell my students' younger siblings horrible things online and stalk them and bully them and try to make them do harm to themselves? No, not when they were putting together two different machines and sending pulses to one another through through the uh, methods as previously unknown. Um, well, what was one of the first things that when everybody achieved like computer code so they could do email, everybody starting erotica listservs and so forth. Well, the classic for that was when I was a teenager and in high school, some teacher put it into my head, and that sort of was a revolution in my thinking, that Henry Ford, when he perfected the automotive assembly line, did not have the goal of changing the sexual mores of the United States, but that's one of the effects it had. Because suddenly, the young people could pile into a car and beep beep, see you later, mom and dad, and drive off who knew where, and have a newfound privacy that they never could have had on foot or with horse and buggies or anything else. They could go farther in many respects than they could have before with a measure of a measure of impunity. But we're far beyond the official topic here. But I just, the more I think about this stuff, the more examples I can think of, and
Oh, it's wonderful.
I would love to hear more examples from any of y'all or anybody y'all talk to in the coming weeks. Because already my friend Sam Miller, who is very smart
Oh,
and
he was
very
one of our speakers.
oh yeah, Sam
Yeah.
is terrific.
Uh,
But Sam has already written me saying, "I want to see the list. I want the bibliography."
I will
and
send it to all 200 members immediately after the
Will
meeting.
do. It's
Yeah.
very preliminary, and all those quotes I was reading are on the handout basically, and it has dates and it also and it has links for many of these short fictions that are freely available online, either in full text or audio versions, one or the other. So, but I sure appreciate all your attention.
Well, and we have upcoming ones that maybe will be of interest because you do overlap. This is one of those, what you're saying, where people cross. For instance, we had to have a special meeting for Wolfgang Fink, who's here at the University of Arizona, and he's a top researcher on digital replacements for eyesight. He's
Ah,
already patented, or, he works with NASA on replacements for the retinal vision. And he will also he knows a lot about the replacements for the optic nerve that are coming up too. And so that's a special meeting because I have a couple friends who have lost their vision, and it's going to be called To See or Not to See.
mm,
And one of the things we learn about digital vision is we will have eyesight in the infrared with it, along with everything that humans can do. So right now, right now, Andy, doesn't that already suggest the whole plot?
oh, absolutely,
Yeah, So that's
absolutely.
Wolfgang Fink, and that will be on the 26th of, I got to get my dates right. Anyway, it's this month, and I believe it is on the 20, is that a Saturday? Yeah, the extra one, 26, same time, but not the usual first Saturday. And I'm going to put the word out even in some other organizations because a lot of the women I'm in organizations with, we're all facing low to no eyesight,
Yeah, yeah.
low, but some of us know. So,
Many of us. My wife has a very slow form of glaucoma,
mhm.
like her dad did, and so we're much conscious of that in our house too. But
So
that's a near universal.
put it on
As
your calendar then, Andy. It's going to be the same time of the morning 9 on the 26th. And so he would have had to wait until after July 2025. And I said, that can't be. So put you right in as a special one.
well,
Uh,
he's worth it.
yeah. And then our November regular speaker will be Hugh. Let me look up his last name. And this is an amazing one because I get all these ideas from my husband, Bob. Um, let me get it right. Hugh Hudson, the Carrington event. Are you familiar with that, Andy?
Oh yes. Mm-hmm.
So he's a big
Mm-hmm.
expert on Carrington event, and he will be talking about that, which is another thing. It won't be like the one in 1850, whatever it was, where hardly anything was, affected. Now
True.
could be a
True.
lot different than in the future.
Um, and Bob is right about how Vern had to depart as needed,
Mhm.
for submarine propulsion and so
Oh,
forth. But I remember an old anecdote, and it may be apocryphal, but Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was speaking after he had become lionized and famous, was speaking at some event about his work and taking questions, and somebody stood up and complained to him that in one of the Sherlock Holmes stories, he had them taking the train and getting off at so and so village. And he said, in fact, the trains from London do not stop at so and so village. You have to get off at so and so. And Conan Doyle said something curt like, "Well, they do now. I made it up. It's fiction." And
yeah.
yes, at a certain point, the verisimilitude eventually breaks down, and that's what makes it fiction. But I think Will Jenkins and Murray Leinster, and for that matter, Verne and Wells would understand that, But the game is to see how far you can take it, how far you can take the extrapolation. And I know that my readers through the years, though I do more games with history and sociology than I do with science per se. But I know how delighted my readers tend to be when they find out that there really was such a person or such an event or so forth,
Mhm.
and that they found out a little about it through this story.
Well, you know what Mark Twain said about passing out taffy, at people's funerals about saying, meaning, I guess in the slang of that day, a lot of profuse praise. But I don't think there could be too much taffy for this presentation you've given, because it really is chock full of like what Ray Bradbury called pomegranate ideas. You are not only a brilliant person, but you really have done us a great thing. And now it's going to be recorded, and people who couldn't make the meeting, and I know there were many who probably will be interested in,
Oh, sure.
you
I'm
know,
sure. I appreciate the opportunity and getting to meet with y'all. Yeah, that I know. I've probably seen every Twilight Zone episode, Bob, a dozen times, but I'm not sure I've even seen one episode of Men into Space. So that may tell you something too. But it's when I think of the 1950s um, sort of limited extrapolations, I think of like some of the early atomic bomb stories, like Judy Merrill's Shadow on the Hearth, about the family trying to get by as
mhm,
the atomic cloud is spreading and so on and so forth. That's a very, if you will, down to earth, in Ryman's words, which were half tongue in cheek, but had a point, like all satire.
mhm.
Mundane SF. There's an example of SF that was mundane, but no less vital and no less thematically apt for its time. Um, but yeah, I need to. There's so much old. Anything I look for online every 5 years, I look for it again, and it turns out that there's so much more available than there used to be, and one of those is of course, old TV shows. I've got fascinated lately about the public domain and all the movies that are in the public domain for various reasons in various countries, and that's an interesting window into that topic, the topic of cinema, as well as all the legal topics involved, copyright topics.
I do find it kind of humorous when people are on these extremely high-tech platforms, and then they go on about how much they hate technology.
Right? Yes. Well, we're all we're all we can only be Luddites so far, and then we've got to get to the doctor's office, or we've got to do go buy groceries or something. But we all, I think, have things that platforms that just annoy us or particular things. But my mother we bought her a microwave, and it made her life much easier for the last 20 years or so of her life. But from day one for the next 20 years, she would approach that microwave like it was a ticking bomb and gingerly press the buttons and step back and look at it. She was never quite sure of it. And
Yeah.
my wife says I do the same thing with stuff, with buttons and so on. So maybe next time we talk, I will have my camera issue figured out.
Yeah, and what you say about language, I would love to do something about the power of language, and using not only Ted Chiang, but especially S.I. Hayakawa, who I feel has been unjustly um, eclipsed, in this day and age. He had some wonderful insights, and now they are being proven by brain scans. What he said, and people laughed at him, that there's a full body response to words. It's true. So,
And he had those ahead of his time insights that as so often are not appreciated until the time catches up,
right.
until you realize that, oh, okay, now we can see this happening. I mean, that was a lot of Einstein, right?
Mhm.
Einstein got a lot less controversial through the decades as we came up with mechanisms that allowed us to test the ideas and
Sure.
see that, oh, okay, well then. I mean, that's happening, you know, generations after his death that's
That's
happening.
so true. Well, once
Well,
again,
I
well,
do
thank
appreciate it all. Oh, that's right. It's true about microwaves. But yes, pose the balloon hoax. Yes.
well, if I could
Um,
move my theremin into this room and if I got on could get it on visual, that's the ultimate science fiction musical instrument. And I have one. My son finally, when I turned 75, decided he'd heard it for decades and he got me a theremin. I mean, you just wave your fingers in the air and you play it. You don't touch anything. And
I've never been in a room with one, to my knowledge. That would be a lot of
it's
fun.
amazing. And it just demonstrates that those electromagnetic waves are there. And your fingers and the resistance of your, magnetism in your hands just make the sounds when there's power, when there's electricity applied.
Right, right. Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much. We do
Thank
appreciate
you.
this.
Thank all of you. I guess I'll press this leave button. But Gloria knows how to get in touch with me if anybody wants to email me or anything else.
Yes, I'm sure you'll probably hear from some folk after I send out your list and your resources.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Gloria.
You're very welcome,
Have a good
Andy. Have a
weekend.
great, you too. And the rest of you, see y'all later.